Before we start today's episode, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, over my right shoulder there. You can find Kyndryl at www.kyndryl.com/institute, where you'll find their brand new institute content from all over the world on AI, on change, on transformation, from the world's best academics, business thinkers, and speakers. It is a massive pleasure to welcome the two authors of this brilliant book, From Resource Allocation to Strategy, Clark Gilbert and Joe Bauer. You're very welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
I had researched this episode, and then I had a chat with Clark, and he goes, you know what? I have some questions I want to ask Joe. And I said, why don't you just be the guest host for today's episode? Because Joe has changed how people saw strategy, gave them new lenses to see strategy. And Clark has seen so many academics and business people flourish because of that. So I want to welcome our host for today, Clark Gilbert. You're very welcome.
Well, thank you for having us. And Joe, what a thrill to be with you. And I'll always be grateful. I was assigned as a doctoral student originally to work with Nitin Noria. And he heard my questions and interests, and he said, do you know Joe Bauer? You should be working with Joe Bauer. So I was never so grateful, Joe, to be handed off to you from someone else. So
my pleasure.
Well, let me just start, Joe, the process research, and in particular, how you connected it into strategy through the resource allocation process itself has led to breakthrough research and insight for practitioners and scholars, everything from disruptive innovation theory to resource dependency, making big bets, change in the presence of fit, and so many other big breakthroughs in the field. What do you think it was about the connection between resource allocation and strategy that has lent so much insight to the field?
I think that the key is that the thinking about long-range planning, thinking about goals as separate from anything else in the organization. That's just particularly something that was primarily economic analysis and forecasting.
Yeah.
Never really was of particular use to company managements, because they would have a team of economists, and yet it didn't link up with goals. And I guess because I came at it from capital budgeting and long-range planning, and they didn't fit together. One was have this view that what you did was figure out what you wanted to do and then broke it up into pieces of assignments and gave it, and that's how it would work. But the allocation of money, capital budgeting, worked the opposite way. We're bottom up. So, and then when I watched it, and that was, I guess, the key, then I spent a year just watching what happened. What, in effect, the way that company was run was determining the direction of the company. And that sounds so obvious.
Yeah.
But it's not the way we talk about things. And it was also much more complicated than any of the models being used to try and help managers. But focusing on how resources were used, and once you sort of say that to a manager, they say, of course that's what it is.
Yeah.
And then sort of linking that to how performance was measured, performance of managers, and how people were paid and promoted, kind of made sense. And that really is what it was, that kind of an intuitive idea that just how you use your resources is going to determine things. And just because you wrote something on paper called a strategy or called your long-range plan, that wasn't going to do anything.
So, Joe, two things I'll pull out of that. One is the actual key insight that how resources are allocated and where they're allocated shapes the resultant strategy.
Right.
That seems so intuitive to those of us who've worked in this field, but it wasn't. Like you said, a lot of people thought it was top down, built at the very senior levels, maybe by a strategy consulting firm, maybe by a senior executive, and then just downloaded onto the organization.
Right.
The other thing you said was that it's much more complex. And in that first chapter of the book, we looked at the model that you originally wrote in 1970, and we've explored in so much depth, but the resource allocation process is multi-level. It's iterative over time so that it's not a one-time event. Roles are inevitably in conflict, and context shapes the strategy that comes out of that. And,
Right.
and some scholars and even executives will say, well, that's frustrating. Why can't it just be clean and simple? So is this just a realpolitik observation of how it actually happens? Or is there something that you could help executives understand so they realize this is more than just politics inside of an organization?
Yeah, I have to give credit to Bruce Henderson because he didn't have the same insight. But he did say, look, as a consultant, I find everybody focused on projects. And that's crazy. They should be focused on businesses and building a business and then which projects are right for that business. But you have to be allocating resources to businesses. And that led to the famous BCG growth, market share. But that was an important insight. So as soon as you take the intuition that it's the allocation of resources that you want to focus on, it's very important to add Bruce's notion. It's businesses.
Yeah.
Because what we saw, both just in my case study, but also others, Don Sol and so on, companies would keep allocating resources to dying businesses.
Yeah. Yep.
But the project proposal would look profitable. And so that was a big step that was important. And I think once company leaders had that insight, began to understand that, then it took off. And then there were all sorts of other problems which were studied in the various theses that we looked at.
Yeah, starting with Clay to Don Sol, Tom Eisenman, Tomonoda, down to me. One of the things that's interesting to me about the research is people kept picking up this insight that resource allocation's a process, A, and then B, that is where strategy is made in an organization. And from resource dependency, how customers capture the resource allocation, that led Clay to eventually see disruptive technology. Tom Eisenman looked at big bets,
Right.
and how that was hard for, Don looked at why are people getting out of, certain technologies in the tire industry into others, Tomo with cell phones, me with the newspaper industry. Even at the end, Clay did that piece on personal life choices.
Yes.
And, and he looked at Harvard MBA alums who had made really bad life choices. And he said it wasn't their strategy, their written strategy. No one started with a written strategy that said, in 15 years, I want to be obsessed with my work, estranged from my children, divorced from my wife. And yet, every day, these little decisions inside the personal resource allocation process changed the strategy, even though the written strategy was different, and so many settings. And what is it, Joe, about that connection, resource allocations to strategy, that have yielded such fruit for so many scholars?
It's real. I mean, you could also ask it the other way. Why has so much academic research of late lacked any intuitive power and been not very useful at all?
Yeah.
I was thinking, we may get to this later, but there's a lot of fraud in published research these days.
Yeah.
Which is terrible. Well, how is that happening? Well, if you can fake the data, but think about process research.
Yeah.
If you don't do that, you go find out what's going on and what the reality is, and then you try to understand it. And over time, you begin to understand understandings make it possible for researchers coming along to do even further work. There are plenty of questions now.
Joe, let's go into that. You talked about why so many miss it. And of course, you can't do this kind of research just sitting in your office. You have to embed yourself in organizations. You have to observe. I remember we used to teach the Intel multi-part case at HBS, and students would see the first, the A case, which was Andy Grove was the CEO, and they were trying to get out of DRAMs and into microprocessors, and he couldn't get the senior leadership to change the budgets. But deep down inside the organization, I think it was the guy on the manufacturing floor was allocating manufacturing capacity based on gross margin per wafer square inch.
Right. But that was the finance group said he had to do that.
And it moved a multi-billion-dollar company out of DRAMs into microprocessors. And Andy Grove thought he had to make this big decision, and he treated it like he had made this big corporate executive decision. But in the end, really, a guy he might not have even known the name of had moved the entire production to the right strategy. And all he had to do was catch up to the corporate budget in R&D. But the MBA students looked at that and they said, oh, that's brilliant. Every company just needs that allocation rule. And they didn't see that could go the other way. So it's brilliant ex post, but ex ante, it's hard to know. And remember, the B or the C case now had Andy Grove trying to get the company to invest in the Celeron processor, which had a lower margin per wafer square inch. And I remember someone held up a cell phone in it, and said, what are you putting in these? And the answer for Intel was nothing. Right. And Andy couldn't get anyone to do it. And it turned out the rule that helped them get into the microprocessor was preventing him from getting into the Celeron, because the Celeron had lower gross margin per wafer square inch. And even then, our MBA students couldn't see it wasn't a new strategy. It wasn't the ex ante deliberate rule that should have been downloaded on the organization. It's that strategy was multi-level, roles are in conflict, it proceeds iteratively over time. All the things you had said, and even our faculty. So these are the MBAs, but our faculty would be like, we study strategy like it's a one-time event. And the more brilliant the analysis, then we don't need to deal with all this complexity in an organization. And they just couldn't see the phenomenon that we are trying to teach in the Intel case.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, the field of strategy has become pretty empty and unimportant. The work that is more interesting was the work that Howard Stevenson was doing with entrepreneurship together with Bill Solomon.
Yeah.
And I think their contribution was really to get finance out of the exhibits and into the heart of the thinking about how a company could grow and how important was how you use resources, the timing of resources, how you could control risk by managing the sequencing of all. But it's so.
Joe, I love the Howard Stevenson, Bill Solomon. Okay, and it's interesting. They couldn't do that in strategy. They had to we created a new unit at HBS. Right. And in a lot of ways, Clay couldn't do what he did inside of the strategy.
In COM, it was, and even to this day, Clay's course sort of sits, it's popular with the students, but it's not academic.
Yeah. And I remember all out of the dignity to our colleagues, I won't say who it was, but one of our strategy colleagues. And I had left HBS and I was running all the LDS Church's media companies. And a bunch of New York media firms asked me to come, and a leading strategy scholar who was still in a strategy department. And he presented the Netflix case and, how strategy should be made at Netflix and how that should be transposed to media companies. And he said, all of the strategy can be made with these two decisions by a strategist. And, why bother with the rest of the organization? I literally couldn't believe he would say that. And yet he really believed it.
Yes.
And what do you think it is about the modern academic enterprise that has made so many strategy scholars miss what happens inside an organization? Either they miss it out of ignorance or they think, well, it's just dysfunctional decision-making. And if we could just get people to rational decision-making, this is how an organization should run.
Think about academia as a large organization. Ask the question then, how are resources being allocated? To whom and why? How is performance being measured? Performance is being measured by published in referee journals, but ideally a journalist. So in fact, the people who are controlling the progress of individuals aren't even the faculty in the schools. It's the editors of the journals. And they are sitting in tunnels. Talk about tunnel thinking. Each journal, and journals have proliferated. I don't know how many there are now. And I remember the first time I went to an academic meeting as a department chair, and you get this book of abstracts. So I'm pretty diligent where I have a job, so I looked at all it. Most of it was terrible. It was crap. And these poor people had been working hard at this stuff. And it was just, and then you begin to talk to academics, and their goal in life is to get senior enough so that they don't have to teach. So it's the whole enterprise, unfortunately, is corrupt.
Joe, I don't know if I've shared it with you, but when I left HBS and I was leading strategy for the universities of BYU, Idaho, BYU Pathway, and in the media organizations. I wrote a short little 5-page case on the Harvard Business School itself. And I started with the formal statement of strategy. And it starts with the opening section with Kim Clark presenting a PowerPoint slide with the mission statement of the Harvard Business School on the first slide. Educate leaders who make a difference in the world. And I take 2 junior academics. It was disguised, but it was me and Mary Tripsis.
Yes.
And we join the faculty. We hear Kim Clark say that strategy. And we're like, this is awesome. This is why we came to the Harvard Business School. We want to do work that will help leaders make a difference in the world. And then the first year, I win a rookie teaching award. And the response from my department isn't enthusiasm. It's, hey, we need to take you out of the classroom because we think you like teaching too much. And I was like, but the mission statement of the Harvard Business School is educate leaders who will make a difference in the world. And they're like, well, your teaching's good enough. You don't need to get any better. Just stop working hard on it. And so after that deflating moment, then, Mary gets a piece published in the Harvard Business Review. And her department chair and colleagues are like, why are you publishing in the Harvard Business Review? And she's like, well, it's the most influential business publication in the world. And they're like, you need to publish in peer-reviewed academic journals. And she's like, but the mission statement says educate leaders who make a difference in the world. They aren't reading the journals. They're reading HBR. And step by step, these 2 young faculty get the message deep in, by the way, back to your model, deep in the organization, that they should allocate their resources. And what are the resources for faculty? Time and attention. It's not money, it's time and attention. And we allocate our time suddenly now to just the peer review academic journals.
That's right.
And then late in the process, I get this research sabbatical, and we're at the Academy of Management, and our colleagues are saying, how did Clark get that sabbatical? And the person that I've written up as my colleague, who loves teaching, loves the MBA students, she says, oh, Clark is so lucky. He gets to be out of the classroom. Teaching is such a tax. And I know she doesn't believe it that way, but every day over those first 5 years of our careers, decisions are going another way.
Right.
And Aidan, you have to understand it's so hard because I'm this junior faculty member. I'm Joe's former star doctoral student. And Joe's like, why are you even going to the academy, Clark? It's a waste of time. But my colleagues are saying he's got to get published. And I win the paper of the year in the Academy of Management Journal, but it gets through by the skin of my teeth. And my editor, I don't think she had ever been inside a business.
Right.
For her, this was, a sociology publication or a psychology publication, not a business publication. And I thought, here's Harvard Business School with a multi-billion-dollar endowment, and it can't carve its own path. It has to replicate every other business school in the world. And with all of those resources, the academy and peer-reviewed journals had captured the resource allocation process. And Joe, I think that is why, your own research is why your research can't be done today by junior scholars. And it, as powerful as HBS is, its own resource allocation system, its strategy has been captured by, in Clay's terms and Robert Bergelman's terms, by its customers, which now aren't students or alumni, are the publishers and scholars at other institutions who definitely don't believe that the mission should be educate leaders who make a difference in the world.
Well, that's exactly right. That's not our main the goal today in our conversation. But if you want to ask, why is it that we're having so much trouble with the Trump administration? It's precisely because of what you're talking about. Because a lot of what got published was really crap. And then I mean, we're lucky that at least they're talking about business. If you think about the impact of Foucault or and Derrida and so, and they're saying there are no facts. There is no reality.
Yeah.
There's a reason why we're having these problems.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting because I think that blind spots for process research and the very kind of research you led so effectively aren't cognitive. They aren't intellectual. They're structural, which is, what the very earliest insights from the resource allocation back to 1970.
I'm just going to come in for a moment because there's a perfect quote I pulled from one of the chapters. It says, Joe Bauer showed how the structure of the incentives and reporting systems shapes which projects operating managers will consider, middle managers will champion, and corporate level executives will fund. This led to the conclusion that structure shapes strategy. And it's perfect for exactly what you're talking about. But also, Clark, what you experienced is what so many people who are listeners to this show, heads of innovation, heads of change or transformation, they come in with the best of intentions, and then they pretty much learn the way things are done around here by the behaviors and the reward incentives.
And Aidan, so many people think it's a cognitive or an intellectual problem. What Joe taught us is it's a structural problem. Joe, do you remember the Teradyne case you wrote?
Sure.
Yeah.
We use that to close in the final chapter.
I remember Joe had Alex Darbeloff come, and Joe and Clay Christensen and I were doing a workshop with the CEO of Kodak, the CEO of Hallmark, the CEO of the U.S., or the Secretary of the U.S. Navy, Intel, all of the CEO and their top 5 reports. We taught that case, and Alex came. Alex had been the CEO of Teradyne, and Joe, the chairman of the board at MIT.
Later, the chairman of MIT, yeah.
Yeah. And I remember one of the vice presidents asked Alex, well, Alex, you understood this. And then you protected new projects from the structure that was killing them. And what if your CEO doesn't understand this? And I remember Alex paused and he said, I'd find another job.
Can you give us a bit of context on that, guys? Could you elaborate a little bit on the Teradyne case?
Alex Darbeloff, the way he would describe it, the first Teradyne makes test equipment for chip manufacturers. And he had all the strength of a good engineer, which is important. He cared about substance. And he was very frustrated because as time developed, his engineers just kept trying to make things more and more complicated. And their customers loved it because they would.
They're leading customers.
Yeah, they're leading customers. And Alex, staying as a good engineer, kept reading the literature. And he became very concerned that new technology was going to permit critical parts of testing to be done with a much, much more simpler process. And he kept trying to get people in his company to study it. And they wouldn't. So finally, he hired a consultant to work with the new technology and see if in fact he was right, and he was. So then he still couldn't. I mean, the power of the customer is very real.
And Joe, I think
he set up a separate unit. And
it was a classic case in the customer captured every part of the resource allocation process. So the salespeople wouldn't prioritize it. The product teams wouldn't make it.
Right.
Because they had built their DNA around the customer. And so an external stakeholder had captured that. And the only way Alex could get around that is create a new context. And that was the new division.
But even there, the head of engineering in that new thing was approaching the problem the way they had always had done it. And Alex said, look, there's a very interesting company. Go talk to them about what they're doing, a new company. How did Alex know that? Well, he stayed broadly aware. And it turned out they were using coding methods that were totally ad hoc, totally specific to a specific problem. And this firm was using Excel. And they modified Excel to do everything this engineering vice president wanted to do. And cost $300. Not only that, you could do it right away instead of taking weeks. So the seeking simplicity, I mean, Alec kept saying to his engineers two things. One, we started with an 8-bit chip. We were able to build a tester with 8 bits. Now, why do you need all this complexity? The second thing, when he would always eat in the cafeteria, and he said, I love to ask the engineers what they're doing, and then why does the customer buy it? And they would always tell me about the product. And I would say, no, I'm asking you, why does the customer buy it? And it was very hard to get them to understand that the customer, this Clay's language now, you're solving a problem for the customer. And if they're buying it, it must be because you're doing it well. And those are such simple ideas. What struck me when I've been thinking about this and thinking about the future, Elon Musk, as a manager of a company, is very unusual. I mean, I think he was disastrous in the government, but think about it. He got a good, attractive car selling in the market 18 months. General Motors, Ford, they can't get a good electric car. So what is it? I wrote down his question. He said, question every requirement. The only laws of physics. Delete any part of process you can. Simplify and optimize, accelerate cycle time, and automate. And we don't know how to deal with that yet. But and what's interesting, when you talk to people from his company, they say he's brutal about asking those questions. And if we aren't persuaded by him when we're discussing something critical, he'll say, okay, you have to do it my way, but it's on me. If it fails, it's so he gets it. He's not holding people's lives accountable for his decision. I think there are a whole bunch of these guys, Clark, that we really don't understand yet, because they're playing a role in what we call definition.
Yeah.
That is a little more powerful than we've studied carefully. And
Yeah.
And there are a bunch of them. I mean, there's Edison, Steve Jobs, that all
Yeah.
Gates built. And that's pretty interesting stuff. I mean, I would say in your world, what you're doing is like that.
Yeah.
You're having a very powerful impact, but you're not ignoring the process.
Well, and even for me, Aidan, if you look at the church's educational system, we have this flagship, scholarly focused National Merit Scholars program in BYU. We have a teaching focused university in BYU, Idaho. We have an online university in BYU Pathway. Someone might think, oh, that's a nice portfolio. But each one of those couldn't do what the other one did in the structural context. They had a resource allocation process that leads to a very different strategy. So to do the next one, you had to do it in a different setting. And, as an executive in my church, of course, it's a spiritual endeavor, but I'm benefited all the time from the early work from Joe and from Clay about how structure determines strategy. And you just can't do certain things. And I think, Joe, the entrepreneurs you described, they're doing things outside of the traditional context. They've
Right.
learned that current system will not yield that answer. So I'm going to create an entirely different system.
In our last chapter, when we look at the model, we put the financial markets and then the product input as context,
Yeah.
external thing. And they have changed so much. And academia hasn't changed. I mean, hardly at all. If anything, it may have gotten more rigid. But I think that's, again, the power of the model is to help people see, okay, if the capital markets want us to perform all the time, and that doesn't fit what we're
I
trying to
can't
do,
deliver this new product.
then I have to find a way of structuring myself so that I'm protected. And some companies have done exactly that.
I wanted to share, guys, a brilliant metaphor I came across. It's about the term undermining, the origin of the word undermine. It's a military tactic, actually. So the whole idea was you'd have big castle walls, then they'd tunnel in under the wall, they'd build a timber frame to keep up the wall structure, and then they'd light it on fire and leave it so that your strength would become your weakness. And I always think about that as a metaphor for what happens here, is that the incumbent has a way of doing things, including a cognitive frame of how to do things. And then the technology shift, the disruptive innovation comes along. And there's a line that stuck with me from Gary Hamel. He said, to give up a bird in the hand, you have to see a flock of birds in the bush. And that when you have a technology, say, that's not based on a Moore's law change, like from an Intel computer chip to a mobile phone, which is much cheaper, and they can't see the future and they can't lean into things like Moore's law, it's that dilemma or that paradox that the real struggle is, and it still remains today with so many companies. And I'd love you to share your thoughts on managing that, because that has not gone away. As you said, Joe, education hasn't actually dealt with those changes, but that paradox or that dilemma hasn't gone away.
Well, this is where I think Clark's thesis, Clark's research added a very important element, and that is attention to the issue of cognitive framing. That if you're, well, we can't, most of it tend to be pretty hardwired. when we get up in the morning, we want things to be the way they were when we went to bed the night before. And when the world is changing, we have a very hard time dealing with it. And boy, is the world changing around us in an important way. I mean, another one of the questions that I put down was just, how is it that things that we thought were very, like in AI in the United States is absorbing huge amounts of power and enormous time to do things. How isn't the Chinese got it so fast and they have a much simpler? What are they doing? Why are their cars even? They are beginning to disrupt Tesla. What is going on there? Now, there are aspects of people will say, oh, it's the Cook's market, they get subsidies and so. But we use subsidies to reinforce what we're doing, not to. So there are things we still need to understand, but we are hardwired to do what we done before.
And Joe, one of the things on this changing cognitive lenses is it's really hard when, you hear rumblings of something coming, but the old model still seems viable for a season. These don't stop and then a new one starts. They often have long periods of overlap. And if your old customers have captured the resource allocation and the capital markets have captured a measure around gross margin or whatever other financial measure, you may not have the crisis in the old world at the time you need to invest in the new. And that really led to the book Scott Anthony and I wrote called Dual Transformation.
Right.
Because you needed to be making changes in both contexts concurrently. And this is already hard enough, but you've got to keep the old context tight and aligned and rewarded in capital markets and customer markets while you're building a new context. And that's why a separate context, a separate division, it sounds like such a simple heuristic, like set up a new division. But it's a simple solution to a very complex problem, which is the old world still is working while the new world is being created. And you can either kill the old world or let that world continue to operate while you start to build a new world in a completely separate context. And you see this in evolutionary biology, and you'll see they draw these with fitness landscapes where a population is still well fit to a climate or an environmental condition, and a new condition is forming on the periphery, and the peak of that world will not be realized by the old peak. In fact, any move from the top of the peak is a downward decline. So if you're trying to optimize, you stay on the top of the peak.
Right.
So I think one of the things, dual transformation, I hate to belittle my work or certainly our beloved colleague Clay's work, but disruptive innovation, dual transformation are all just really interesting applications of Joe's original theory. So, Joe, can I ask this question? Clay comes along, his doctoral student, late in mid-career, comes back to do his doctorate. After Clay, I'll get the sequence out, but Tom Eisenman, Tomo Noda, Don Sol, me, some of those folks are really, really smart. Others like me, we're just above average on our best days.
Okay.
But you kept I don't know if it was every one of your doctoral students in that 10, 12-year period, but almost every other year, your doctoral students won best doctoral paper in the Academy of Management. Were you just good at picking these guys? Were they really smart? Or what was it about the lens you gave all of us that helped us see things others had missed?
I would say it was two things. One, I insisted that people essentially get out and look at something. And I read, Eve Dawes talks about this. He said, Joe introduced me to some, I think it was, and then he just left. And so I had to do it. And I think that's the second thing, that if you want people to really think, you can't constrain them, because all you're going to do is tell them what they can't do and what's not right. And they have to have the opportunity to start really talking to people who are way up there and beginning to understand and sitting in a room and watching what's going on. And I think it wasn't that I can't, I mean, the people you mentioned all are pretty brilliant, including Clark Gilbert. But the key thing was to get them up. And
You know, it's interesting, Joe. You had Clay do a deep dive in disk drives.
yeah,
Tom Eisenman did a deep dive in the cable industry, Don Soul in the tire industry. You know, poor Don. I mean, who wants to study tires for 4 years? But, you know, Tomo in the cell phone industry, me in the newspaper industry. I remember when we identified this industry, my first trip, you know, got on an airplane, went out to an industry meeting in the Bay Area, all these newspaper companies that didn't know a person, and I just started networking. And within 3 months, I was in with the CEO of the 10 largest media companies in the world, and in the United States at least, and months and months of watching their decision meetings and where decisions were made and going on sales calls, watching the newsroom meetings. I mean, things I just wouldn't have done. And Joe pushed us in there. And all of his students, they knew these, if you went into Clay's office, there were all the disk drives sitting on a shelf. And, Tom Eisenman knew those CEOs and their teams at all the cable companies. And, I knew every newspaper executive and their leadership team in the U.S., in the entire country. And I do think Joe pushed us, you pushed us, Joe, into deep. We knew them, those industries, we knew those organizations, and we were looking at them with this question: where is strategy being made?
Yeah.
And why isn't it being made the way you would think? And I, we're all blessed that I think we had your framework, but you also pushed us into organizations in a very embedded way.
Well, I don't know how much have you run into Howard Hume?
Yeah, I don't know him well, but Aidan brought him up the other day.
Yeah. Well,
I have his book right here, Joe. He's coming on his house soon.
He was the last in the sequence, but he did a population study of motherboard makers in Taiwan. I mean, it's just incredible. But that's how you learn.
Yeah.
And
well, Joe, what advice? This is hard. Not a lot of scholars would tell you go deep, spend a year and a half inside an industry and a group of organizations. They'd say, put it into a statistical tool, run a regression, and see what you find. For rising scholars coming up in this climate that we talked about, what advice would you have for future scholars who wanted to make a big difference in the world?
It's a very hard question. when I talk with people who are thinking about going into doctoral work, I'm talking about because they have to go to a place where they'll get support. Either that or there are places that they're asking a good question, will hire them, like some of the consultant firms will hire you and say, fine, you do that for a while, and we understand that if we can't keep you, you're going to go back and write about it. I think that you just have to have a year or two to look at something. And I mean, typically, if you haven't been talking to executives, you don't even know what's an important question.
Yeah.
And I mean,
I love that, Joe. I think Clay wrote that little piece once on anomaly seeking research. Where do great questions come from? And I remember I had been studying decision making when you were under threat. And I was looking at the newspaper industry, but I was still really early. I didn't have a good question set. And we were in a doctoral seminar you ran. We're reading. And by the way, Aidan, you grow up so much when you're under Joe's development. I remember asking Joe, well, what's going to be on the test? And he looked at me like I was an absolute neophyte. And he's like, well, what do you want to learn? He's like, the whole point of this is for you. We don't care about tests. We want you to learn. And so I built some of the readings, and we were reading Dutton and Jackson out of the University of Michigan, who said, under threat, people become risk avoiding. And Kahneman and Tversky had said, under threat, people become risk seeking. And I realized there's one of Clay's anomalies.
yes.
They can't both be right. And I finally realized that Dutton and Jackson were talking about process. Kahneman and Tversky were talking about expenditures. And what I was seeing in the newspaper was tightening process, but increased risk-taking to spend money.
Right.
And I knew at that point, Joe, you didn't have to be that smart. I had a good question, the right industry, and any idiot could find something really interesting from that point on. I just had to go do it. And I think we spend today, modern doctoral students spend so much time on methods, research methodologies, statistical analysis. They don't ever look at what's an interesting question in the first place.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's all over. I mean, I have a grandson who is an astronomer, and he's been spending, I think, the last 4 or 5 years, he's been an intern, but he's been working at Keck, the observatory in Hawaii. Yeah. And everybody wants to hire him because he actually knows a lot. And we're discussing getting a doctorate, and it's not clear when he's going to be able to do better because he has a doctorate, other than earn a living as an academic. But
there's a brilliant line, again, this is serendipity. I just have a bunch of quotes in front of me. In one of the segments, like you wrote this piece, you said the psychological literature often describes cognitive frames as schema, a pattern imposed on a complex reality to help interpret and guide response. Schemas employ 3 basic coding processes to respond to stimuli: abstraction, interpretation, and selection. What is encoded is heavily determined by a guiding schema or knowledge framework that selects and actively modifies experience in order to arrive at a coherent, unified, expectation-confirming, and knowledge-consistent representation of an experience. Only the information that is relevant and important to the currently active schema will be encoded. And that came to mind when you said, you asked Joe what's going to be on the exam. because if he had said that, you'd only pay attention to what was on the exam.
Yeah.
And you don't learn then. But I'm saying that for that reason, but also because what your work, and I'm talking to both of you here, I've read your work and studied it. What it is a new schema or a challenge to your existing schema. So at least you have new lenses through which to look at the world. And I think that, for me, that's the joy and the goal of education, including doing things like this show. That's why I'm personally so keen to bring this work to people, is so they have new schema and they can make at least more informed decisions. And I believe that's what both of you have contributed to the world.
Well, Aidan, thank you. And talk about the power of a schema is Joe's original framework and, the rippling effect it had. And you've been so generous to let us have this time to have this conversation. Joe, I'm going to close with a thought, and then I'll turn it to you for the final remarks. First of all, my life has been so impacted by Joe's mentorship. And Joe, I want you to know how grateful I am. It really changed my life. I would not have gotten the insights in my research. I wouldn't have been hired onto the faculty. And even today, the impact I'm hopefully having on education around the world for my church is in large part because of the way you taught me to think all those years ago. And even beyond the work and resource allocation, the strategy at an organization level, when I was asked to go, originally by Kim Clark and the church, I made a resource allocation decision. And it was hard. I'd been trained in a field. I loved teaching at the Harvard Business School. But I didn't let the structure shape my personal strategy. And I'm so grateful I made a decision that really shaped a personal strategy and a huge change in my life. And I'm grateful to have been mentored and taught so well. I hope you know how much all of us, Clay, Tom, Tomo, Don, so many of us who you impacted. And we look back at the impact you've had on us in awe. It's an impact on a field, but it's also an impact on a group of individual scholars, both professionally and personally. And I tip my hat to you, and what an opportunity to have this time to have this conversation and reflection today.
Well, Clark, and that is extraordinarily generous, and I appreciate it. And all I can say is that I have felt very lucky that I went to Harvard Business School, because it was a totally different set of values at that time than the rest of academia. Most of the faculty really believed the mission that him, and then all that happened with me is that some professor said to me, "You seem to really enjoy the classroom. Have you ever thought of teaching?" And of course I hadn't, but I did. And it was an environment that supported crazy ideas. So that when I was so young, but when I think I was I joined 63. I joined the faculty. So at that point I was 24, I think. And then I was just my father had met this guy who was a chief economist at a big company, and my father told him that I was very interested in planning and capital budgeting and so on. He said, "Come talk to me." And it's through that guy that who said, well, it's really, and then he introduced me to some other people who were very fascinating. And when I went to talk to the dean, he said, well, I'll help you. And so he called the CEO of that company and said, would you let our guy in? And I mean, that's how it worked. And I think it remains when the last classes I taught were at the Kennedy School. And I learned that about half to 3/4 of my class was foreign students. And they were going to lose their fellowships from their countries if they didn't get A's.
Wow.
So I remember I told the class, look, this is crazy, but it's the way it is. So here's what we're going to do. You stop worrying about final grades. I'm going to keep asking you to do written work, and I'm going to give you grades you've never seen before. And I discovered that's a great contract. I don't reason to look at it. I mean, it was very clear and real feedback, honest feedback, willingness to talk to them about what they were doing and what was wrong with it. And they just blossomed. It was a great fun. And I did it. So in my own view, I think we can improve education if we find better ways of giving feedback than published grades or scores. I think I'm horrified that to avoid bias, we're going to go more and more toward quantitative measure.
Yeah.
So all I guess I'm saying is that I was just very lucky that that my particular set of skills was appreciated at Harvard Business School, and they gave me the resources to go.
Well, what a phenomenon. Thank you, Joe. And
Thank you.
Aidan, thank you for this time and for the work you're doing.
A pleasure. And speaking of resources, that's the book these two gents put together. It's a fascinating read. It needs a deep dive. It's the only way you learn. You give it the adequate resource and attention in order to learn. It's a brilliant book. From resource allocation to strategy. The two authors of that book, Joe Bauer and Clark Gilbert, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As always, thank you to our sponsor, Kyndryl. You can find the Kyndryl Institute app and the Kyndryl Institute content at www.kyndryl.com/institute, where you'll find thoughts from the world's leading experts in change, technology, AI, and so much more. See you next week.